For today's critical thought, we're returning to the topic of early access, and we're going to be discussing how this program has become an effective tool for developers to iterate and play test on their titles, but at the same time, some of the major risks and a major thing you need to understand before going into early access if you expect your game to succeed through it. When it comes to the independent space, one of the more often harder aspects of game development is being able to iterate and refine on an idea. And part of that is that you need playtesters. You need somebody to look at your game to let you know whether or not it's good, bad, or whatever. And one of perhaps the best programs that have come onto Steam in the last 5-6 years has been early access. The means of being able to sell your game while it's in development and make constant and iterative updates to it through its dev cycle. This has been a part of the success of many notable names in the industry, from Prison Architect, Slay the Spire, Duskers, Factorio. Factorio, of course, was pre-early access as well, and of course our lovely game up there, Auction Not Included. And Clay Entertainment specifically have done some amazing work and been very successful on early access. I think every one of their games, starting from Don't Starve, has been an early access title. And right now they have the beta for Auction Not Included, Grifflins, and I think there's one more, or I may be confusing that with another developer. Nevertheless, early access has become a very effective way of allowing you to essentially have your cake and eat it too. I can develop a game, at the same time I'm earning money for the game, and I'm getting all this feedback so I can help improve that game. Unfortunately, as we have seen, early access is not the magical success button that a lot of people hope it would be. And it's important to understand what does and what doesn't work on early access, and how to properly go into it as a developer. So, the first thing is what games work best on early access. And what we have seen time and time and again is that linear titles, as in a game that has a very fixed start, middle, and end, aren't the best for early access. The point is that you want people to keep playing your game, you want them to keep sending you feedback, and you have to keep them invested in the game. A linear title keeps them invested in it one time. What's worse is that with a linear game, they are playing a fixed story at the roughest point of your title. So what's the chance you're going to come back and experience another 8 to 10 hour long tale when your game is finished? This is why, again, that games that focus on replayability, variance, or something that is very esoteric or uniquely designed work really well on the early access platform. Again, there's a reason why Auction Not Included, Factorio, and some of the other games we've mentioned we haven't even discussed yet worked so well. Now, when it comes to going on to early access, you need to consider the plan for your development. Specifically, what is the goal of my early access? Is this just to get simple playtesting? Am I full on developing this game with feedback from the audience? You need to consider this because the plan of your early access needs to be laid out in full for the people who are playing and hopefully interested in your game. If they see that your plan is release patch next month, nothing for 12 months, put out a minor patch a month after that, people aren't going to stay around. And one of the worst things you can do for early access is to have such a poor showing that it kills all interest and momentum that your game has. And we've seen this, unfortunately, with plenty of games where the title comes out in early access, people don't like it or they're not interested in it, it gets very little support, so nobody play tested, so when it's finally released, it's very much the same game that people hated 6 to 12 months ago previously. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about in the second half is going to go more into detail about this kind of, I guess, pre-planning of early access, or pre-early access, I guess you could say. Now, having a plan for early access also means being able to basically stick with it. And you need to understand that developing your game in early access is different than developing it in private or having, private testers. Because if your game is being sold, it means that whatever version of your game that is available, it needs to be stable. You can, of course, have the beta branch or the untested branch that we've seen many early access developers do. But if somebody buys your game day 1, day 65, day 235 of early access, that build better work. Because nothing sows mistrust in a developer than buying your game and realizing that it's not working. And the same goes for prologue editions. I recently tried to put prologue for a game that basically didn't get past title screen. That's not good when you're trying to show people that you are worthy of being supported. And you need to consider again an update schedule. Some developers think that I can release an update every week. And depending upon your game and your design scope, maybe. But the catch is, every patch you put out will probably introduce more bugs. Those bugs will need to get patched before you put in new content. And releasing 4 patches a month, or 5 depending upon the month itself, can start to put you in this just state of never-ending patching for your games. What we've seen is minimum maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks between patches for smaller stuff. And ideally for like a major patch or something that's going to move your game forward, a month to maybe 2 to 3 months. Again, there is no set schedule for this. It really depends on the game's design and on your team itself. If your team is comfortable putting out a major update every 4 weeks, go for it. If you need, 60 days, whatever, you can also go for that. But again, you need to spell this out to your consumers. If you tell them that a patch is going to be out 45 days from now, well, on that 45th day, there better be a patch coming out. Clay over there has done really great jobs with the early access by actually putting on the title screen when the next major update of the game is going to be. And that is a really solid way of letting people know that the developer's on this and you got something coming. Hades did this, 20XX I think did this as well. And again, whatever you can do to build trust with your audience is huge for early access. And speaking of which, it's important to keep them updated as to what you're doing. Another easy trap you can fall into is only reporting when you have something major to do. As in, I'm going to spend 59 days working on this patch, and I'm not going to tell anyone about it until the 50 or 60 days. I'm not going to tell anyone about it until the 59th day. You want to do updates, whether it's daily, weekly, bi-weekly, whatever. And we've seen many developers go the route of having online devlogs or dev streams to show people that, hey, we're working on this game. It's being made. We didn't just take your money and run away, which has been a fear for many Kickstarter projects, but that's a topic for another day. Now, when it comes to planning your early access, one thing that we have learned time and time again is having a set release date inevitably ends in failure. You will never be able to tell somebody that I know in exactly 2 years, 27 days, 5 minutes, and 47 seconds from now that my game will be 100% done and perfect. I bet every developer wish they could do that. So it's important to be very flexible with your dates. Don't be afraid to push something back or take something out if you see that it's not working. And remember, early access is kind of a marathon. You have to keep going into it again and again until that game is at 1.0. Speaking about 1.0, when your game is done or when you've hit that state, you want to make sure that that is a major milestone. We've seen some developers who 1.0 simply means we fixed the audio bug. Our game is done. And some developers will just literally cut out a quarter of their game and then save it for 1.0. And you have to be really careful about that. First off, if you are saving content before 1.0, make sure you have your own internal testing team to look that over. Because we've seen developers will hold off on releasing content, put it in 1.0 and then realize it's completely imbalanced and everybody hates it, so now we need to refine and edit it again. This was part of the issue we saw with the Darkest Dungeon, specifically the Darkest Dungeon of the Darkest Dungeon at 1.0. Another point is that when your game is released, this is your big marketing push. One of the challenges of early access is keeping momentum going. And when your game is released, this is the time to immediately, release the hounds, sound the alarms to YouTubers, streamers, people of the press, to let them know that your game is done. Now, one final point before we move on. Just because you hit 1.0 in an early access game doesn't necessarily mean that the work is immediately done. You always have to work on any final patches or bugs that come about. And if you are going for a long-term game, something like Oxygen Not Included, Monster Train, Slay the Spire, you should also inform people as to what your plans are beyond launch. Sometimes you can just say, this game is done. It's finished. We're going to move on to something else. And some developers will say, well, we're going to work on a few more expansions and patches down the line. But again, you need to communicate that to people. So, with that said, we are going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get a little serious, as we're going to talk about what kind of mindset or development you need to start with if you want to have any attempt at succeeding in early access. And now for a quick thank you to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, linked down below. Now available at most retailers are my current books on design. 20 Essential Games to Study is an intro-level look at 20 unique games to provide inspiration for any developer looking to get into the game industry. And the Game Design Deep Dive series each go into a top-to-bottom look at the design of a specific genre, with platformers and roguelikes now available, and horror coming in the near future. One of the biggest misconceptions you can make when it comes to early access is knowing when to go on it in the first place. And this is something that I think sounds kind of weird for a lot of you watching this right now. Because you would think that early access means the second I have something done, let me put it up there. And when early access first came about, that's what we saw. Plenty of people releasing basically prototype version 1 of their game on early access and telling people, give me $20 to develop this more. And what we have learned is that for every success on early access, there have been many more failures. And failure means different things in this context. This could be failure of success, as in game goes to early access, it releases, and it does poorly. Then there is failure of just early access itself, as in game goes into early access, and it never gets finished, and it becomes abandoned. And what you need to understand about early access is how to get into it in the first place and what you should have going in, because things have changed time and time again, just as the market for the game industry. So the first thing is that if you're going to early access, your core gameplay loop needs to be finished. What I mean by that is on day one of your game in early access, I should be able to see where this game is going. And your game should not be majorly being changed through its early access. This goes back to plenty of talks about what we said about the core gameplay loop. That if you change your core gameplay loop, you're changing every aspect of your game at the same time. And what we have found, sadly, is that a quick way to spot if a game is going to fail on early access is if the core gameplay loop keeps getting altered throughout its development. Now, the game you see on screen right here is Godhood from Abbey Games, and this is probably going to go down as my most disappointed game of 2020, which, as a very sad coincidence, Clockwork Empire is another game that didn't work through its early access, was the same for its year of release. And what we saw in both cases is that when the game was released on early access, it was okay. there was the framework for a game here, but people weren't responding as well to the core gameplay loop, or the developers weren't figuring it out at the time of early access. So what ended up happening was that the developers kept changing the core gameplay loop or changing the elements surrounding it. With Clockwork Empires, the game received multiple system changes for how your towns would work. And what ended up happening was every time they made a change, it took about a month or two of development. If that change didn't work and they had to either rescind it or reverse it or do something else, that's another 1 to 2 months of development. And those previous 2 months were white. And this became a case of going 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And this is bad when it comes to developing a game. With Godhood, what we saw was that the developers pitched a game that the audience, or the description of this game that developers pitched, was not what people got when it entered early access. People were expecting more of a hands-on experience. And instead, we got this very indirect kind of quasi-strategy game. And the problem is that when that pushback was there, the developers essentially had to enter emergency mode. And we saw them, again, get into this cycle of trying to fix these issues. Spend a few months in development, release a patch, doesn't work, spend a few more months, reverse the previous patch. And here is the problem with this. Every month you spend trying to fix an issue is a month you're not spending improving your game. And this can lead into a death spiral for any game or any company. Because what I have seen is that by the time the developers finally dial this all in, it could be months or even years of development down the drain. And in many cases, the developer does not have the income or the support anymore to now kind of restart early access now that things have been fixed. In the previous post, or in the previous part, another thing I want to bring up is, again, you have to adhere to early access as part of your business. One of the more famous examples of early access failure was Space-Base DF9, and this became probably one of the biggest black marks or red strikes against Double Fine in the last 10 years. What happened was they were essentially pitching a Dwarf Fortress-like, and they had some very crazy and inspiring ideas for it. So they put on early access, it came out, and then they disappeared for about 4 to 5 months after that early access. And what the developers did was they decided to go work on game jam ideas, and that the framework for Dwarf Fortress was basically there to fund the entire development. So their whole plan of developing the game in early access was to earn enough money to develop the game in early access. And what ended up happening was people didn't want to pay for a game's development when they had no idea what was going on. So they ran out of money. The game, they basically lied to people about the state of the game. They released it, and we ended up with a game that was maybe less than a quarter of what was promised. And like I said, early access is not the magic solution that will fix every game. You need to come into this with a game plan. You need a strategy for what your game is now, what you're developing in early access, and what is it going to be like when your game hits 1.0. This again is why Clay Entertainment has become very much the new poster child of early access, taking the baton away or the crown away from Prison Architect. That when they release their games in early access, it is most often predominantly done from a core gameplay loop standpoint. This is a game that we know what it is now, we know what it's going to end up with. And the rest of the time is adding to it. It's making it better. And we know pretty much at any time what the developers are working on next. And again, that kind of build-up or that kind of trust is huge for early access. And if you lose it, your game is going to very much be dead. And if you release a game without the promises kept, people are going to remember that, and that can easily doom a studio just as much as a failed Kickstarter can. So, to wrap things up, we have one more thing I want to discuss. And this is so serious, we're switching back to me. We don't want to, there's no footage here. As over the last 5 years, I've had a chance to play many early access games. And I'm about to say something that may not make much sense. But I can tell day one of playing a game in early access whether or not that game is going to turn out well. And here's the dirty little secret about putting your game on early access. Your game, from a quality standpoint, on day one, should be just as good as your game on release day of early access or retail. And I know that doesn't make sense when I say it like that, but what I mean is that on day one of your game on early access, I should see a completed and well-structured core gameplay loop. I should be able to tell on day one, hour one of playing your game, what the next 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, of your game's development is going to look like. Because if I can enjoy your game now, on day one of early access, I know it's going to be an amazing game or even a fantastic game when it comes off of early access. And I know some of you may be scoffing at that, but let me give you a few examples. Slay the Spire, Darkest Dungeon, Monster Train, Factorio, Auction Not Included, Grifflins, Hades, and there's probably several dozen more that I'm forgetting off the top of my head right now. Each and every one of those games I played very early into their early access. Sometimes day one, sometimes week one or month one. And when I played those games, I saw that there was greatness on that very same day. I saw a core gameplay loop that worked. And going back to, again, the examples of Godhood, Clockwork Empires, and several other games we played, that the games that worked, they continued to work all the way through. They didn't need to be changed majorly throughout early access because the wheel was already done. They didn't need to rebuild or redo the wheel in that case, or in a matter of speaking. But when I see a game that on day one, it's just not working out for me, the red flags go up in my head. And this is why you need to be very careful when you go into early access. Because early access version 1 needs to be a strong showing for your game. Should all the artwork be done for your game? No. Should your game be 100% fully sketched out and developed? No. But whatever is in that first version of early access should be as amazing for your game as it can get. Slay the Spire's UI was fantastic on day one of early access. Same goes for when I played the very first beta of Monster Train, Auction Not Included, and so on. These games wowed me immediately. Did they get better through its early access? Of course they did. But I wasn't nervous about this game when I first played it. And again, you want to make sure that your first version of your game needs to start strong. Because here's the dirty little secret. The games that succeed early access start out great, and then they grow from there. They don't start out bad and eventually get good. And I hate to say that because it sounds like I'm very much coming down on a lot of games that we've played. But again, if I can't enjoy your game on day one, the chance that you're going to fix that issue on top of fixing everything else and building your game out is very low. And another thing that I often see is that there will be a game that we play on early access that I'm like, it's just okay. I'll come back and see if it improves. What happens is when I do come back, that game hasn't improved. The issues I had with that game day one are still there. It's just that now we don't have the excuse of it's in early access to say why this game is not working. And as we've said with how the market has changed and so on, you want to wait until your game is confident or you are confident in your design before you go on early access. Again, early access is going to be the time to refine and improve your game. It's not the time to put out fires and right a sinking ship. And if you approach it like that, more often than not, you are going to fail. As we saw the case of Woken that we played earlier, the game was released and it just dive bombed in terms of content. And again, the developer has spent, I think, the better part of a year to 2 years trying to fix and course correct. Now, will they succeed? I don't know at this moment. There are good words about it. But again, once things have started to go downhill, it's very hard to get things fixed. As we also saw with Evolve, RIP there, and why hopefully we don't see with Back 4 Blood. To wrap things up, early access is a very effective option for you as a developer if you go into it with the right preconceptions and with the right game plan for how you want your title to develop. If you don't, or you think you can just rush it or lie to people about your game, it is going to end in disaster. And sadly, even if you do have a really solid beginning, it can still run into trouble. I've been trying to keep an eye on Kid Baby Star Child and Rise of the Slime, which if you haven't checked those games out, I would suggest you do. And they were both very impressive, and they've kind of disappeared off the radar. And it sometimes ends in that self-fulfilling prophecy that people don't play the game, so the developer stops working on it. People then see the developer stop working on it, declare the game is dead, and then the game really does die. And there's nothing else you can do about it. So, with that said, to wrap things up, besides the games that I've mentioned and talked about, can you think of other examples of games that had either a solid early access success or a complete early access failure? Let me know in the comments below. If you have a topic for me to talk about in a future piece, please get in touch. Check out our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.